seen him somewhere.
Ada, I'm fried. Can't we get a beer someplace?
Do you know who he is? He's a celebrity.
But who cares?
I seen in the papers that he was in Rome. Eddie, that's the famous Simon Templar.
First appearing in Leslie Charteris's novels of the late 1920s, The Saint follows the adventures of a Robin Hood-like gentleman that travels the world. Although appearing to undertake a multitude of tasks throughout the later 7-year TV run of the 60s, Simon Templar is most attributed to being a rogue detective that protects the good and fights the evil, ranging from small-time crooks to internationally organised gangs. Charteris first began writing novels during his time studying in King's College as a young adult, and following the successful publication of his first novel, he decided to leave education to pursue an exciting life that involved many varied occupations, including pearl diving and gold mining, all in the pursuit of becoming unconventional, more so to further influence his exciting novel ideas. Rather than similar to the method actors of today, Charteris believed that involving himself in unconventional and exciting jobs across the world would reflect positively within his new novels, mainly from experiencing the prospect of uncertainty that he'd often faced switching between careers consistently. Just as a detective may face switching between cases within his novels. It was in this time of rapid career change that Charteris produced his first novel concerning Simon Templar, namely the 1928 novel Meet the Tiger. Templar is immediately introduced as a young, eccentric detective in his first appearance, not straying far off of his later depictions in Roger Moore's TV show, which shall be explored later in this documentary. Reflecting upon this apparent popularity in Templar's introduction to the novel world, Charteris naturally set upon writing more novels concerning Simon Templar's adventures throughout the 1930s, which eventually proved to be so popular that Charteris helped introduce a series of films in the late 30s and early 40s based upon his earlier novel works. George Sanders, an accomplished British actor and singer of the golden age of cinema, undertook the majority of these early Templar depictions to great success. During this time, Charteris continued to write and publish novels subjecting Simon Templar to the many evil entities plaguing the world, in a literary career spanning 50 years from the 20s until the 70s, including over 100 appearances of Templar in print, ranging from full novels to novellas and short stories. 1962 saw the introduction of a television format of the Saint, depicted by the great Roger Moore. Arguably, this incarnation of the Simon Templar remains as the most remembered and popular example of the Saint. Spanning 7 years, 118 episodes, many fan clubs celebrating the show in some form, and ultimately a still large following 60 years later. Moore originally wanted to purchase the rights to produce such a show before even beginning to play the role of Templar, but ended up partially owning production rights halfway through the show's run. Moore is also famously remembered for his portrayals of James Bond in the early 70s, a character which resonates very strongly with the earlier portrayal of Templar. In fact, Moore was offered to play Bond more than once throughout the Saints' production run, but with obvious conflicts in filming, Moore had to decline. The traditionalistic ideals of masculinity seen in the decades leading up to the 60s were soon becoming irrelevant amidst the appearances of many new action-orientated movies and TV shows towards the start of the decade. Natural rejuvenation in many Western economies such as Britain and the US saw many more young individuals with more money behind them, and no longer in a mass economic recovery following a world war such as many were a decade earlier. This gradual evolution into healthier and wealthier populations in early 60s Britain began to be plainly evident within the many scripted TV shows, including the reflection of masculinity itself, which was now drawing heavily upon material culture and commodity consumption, as opposed to the work hard, play little ethic of many traditional and family-based ideals seen a decade earlier. Simon Templar portrayed this evolution in masculine ideals perfectly towards the beginning of the decade, and set the stage for many other productions to draw inspiration from for the remainder of the 1960s. Masculinity was no longer seen as the hard-working, honest, and traditional man providing it for his family day to day, but now instead idealized as a young professional jet-setting his way across the globe and meeting many beautiful women along the way, but more than anything, becoming heavily indulgent in material consumption. Often seen as a playboy lifestyle by many critiques reflecting upon the decade, this change of ideals in masculinity had formed from underlying developments in commodity consumption present in early 60s Britain. As many more people could afford to do more recreational activities and purchase more material objects, this helped influence what people saw as the new standard. Characters such as Simon Templar led the way in this new style of masculine identity, heavily influencing what it really meant to be a man in the 60s. But while not everyone could live a life like Templar, the saint was seen as a mythologized fantasy, for thousands of viewers rather than an accurate reflection of society. Yet this essence of unobtainability further fueled the evolved ideals of masculinity, as Templar's exciting and flamboyant lifestyle could never be anything more than a dream for many audiences. This new representation of glamorous and flamboyant living presented by Simon Templar became idealistic enough that it successfully influenced many other shows and movies throughout the remainder of the 60s and beyond, with the James Bond franchise beginning 2 years later and a character approach very similar to Templar, thus becoming a staple of British masculinity in 60s Britain. Without this level of fluidity present in Simon Templar, he simply would not have progressed so successfully throughout the decades following his first appearance in 1928. It is evident that this extent of malleability allowed Templar to conform to the more traditionalistic ideals of masculinity throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, yet smoothly transition into the changing ideals of the 60s for his TV appearances. And this may be why he has endured to be a staple of action culture for almost a century. Broadening further on the extent of Simon Templar's elasticity, it becomes interesting to see how the character has survived so well throughout its near-century existence, and how many formats have been used successfully to ensure that Templar is always portrayed realistically within the environment depicted in the novel, movie, or show. Simon Templar proved to be a worthy candidate within the imperialist spy genre of the 1920s and 30s, appearing much later than the likes of the 39 Steps and many other classic novels. Chartres invented a real-life character that suited the real-life environment that surrounded it at the time, and not something far-fetched into the distant future like many novelists may have dreamed of. This likeness of a fictional character within the environment of many real people and events, including the uncertainty of an interwar period and many spy scares glooming throughout Western civilization, cemented the Saint books as thrilling adventure novels for many audiences before the later film and TV appearances of Templar. The introduction of Simon Templar as a physical character from the late 30s onwards further accentuated its flexibility to conform to the culture of the time. Very much a staple of masculinity in the traditional sense, the RKO film series of the Saint drew inspiration from many of Chartreus's best works to introduce fans to the first example of a real actor depicting Simon Templar. Examples of the former traditional ideals of virtue and masculinity can be witnessed throughout the film series, during a time in which masculinity was still idealized as a tough, hard-working man who earned his way through an honest living, yet again very aligned with the outdated patriarchal society of the time. Since our entire focus is on Moore's portrayal of Simon Templar in the 60s, it becomes necessary to rather focus on the Saint's appearances after Roger Moore, in which there have been two memorable examples. A short-lived show titled Return of the Saint from 1978 to 79, and Van Kilmer's The Saint in 1997, the former choosing to be very reminiscent in style to Roger Moore's depiction some 2 decades earlier, and with many references towards both the 60s show and the early films of the 30s and 40s. The latter undertakes a completely different approach to Simon Templar, being viewed as a do-gooder to the greatest extent, often choosing to remain pacifistic against enemies and refraining from killing them, something that would not align with Chartreus's ideals of Simon Templar. Nonetheless, both later memorable depictions of the Saint remain to be fitting of the environment in which they appeared in, with British culture still not evolving radically between the 60s and late 70s, except for advancements in many industrial areas. Return of the Saint was met with praise in its similar composition to Roger Moore's, yet not truly groundbreaking for the time, unlike Roger Moore's fresh interpretation in the early 60s. Delving further into the external yet underlying influences of The Saint in the 60s, it slowly becomes clear as to why this show appeared so radical to many audiences as opposed to any other previous rendition. The world itself was in a process of radical change, and people now began to look elsewhere for relaxation, recreation, or enjoyment other than depending on their families or localities to provide this. A large contributing accessory to this evolution involved household TVs beginning to become a normality throughout British and American culture during the mid-1950s onwards. Naturally, the interest for producing new shows and programs to cater for this blooming area of home entertainment caught the attention of many broadcasting companies during this time. And as successful TV shows correlated to great numbers of viewers tuning in, advertisement was also seen as an important factor to cater for. As discussed in Bill Oscarby's interesting discussion regarding The Saint, ITC producer Lou Grade saw this newly found market as an opportunity to introduce an exciting new action TV show that would bring thousands of viewers in each episode, eventually being The Saint in 1962. As this newly found market was blooming and many new investors were catching on to the idea of advertisement in the form of TV shows and short program breaks, finances were continually rising for many successful TV shows throughout the 50s and 60s, which naturally reflected into the presentation of the shows themselves. The Saint is a perfect example of this. As an extremely successful show from the beginning, increasing finances from investments and advertisements payments allowed the show's producers to fund the ideals that the show was attempting to convey. Without this radical success, Roger Moore would not have been able to race around in a brand new Volvo P1800, nor would the show be able to continue producing for 7 years. Audiences loved the show, and investors loved the audiences. Politics were also another defining factor towards how Simon Templar portrayed throughout the 60s. As the Cold War was at its height in Britain and America during the mid-60s, especially following the Cuban Missile Crisis, real-life influences upon fictional spy shows naturally were an occurrence, and although The Saint had already existed as a spy thriller for decades before, contemporary issues during the 1960s also had their effect, including at least 4 episodes concerning Templar dealing with some form of Russian antagonist, being The Saint Sees It Through, The Helpful Pirate, The Gadget Lovers, and When Spring is Sprung. As much as any other action show of the time would portray Russians as, The Saint portrayed them as troublemakers throughout all 4 examples, with an instance of a scientist being kidnapped and sold to Russians in The Helpful Pirate. If it were not for these rising concerns of a war crisis during the mid-60s, would shows such as The Saint even have portrayed the Russians as opponents? I think that it is fair to say that these instances of Russian portrayal in The Saint were and shall always be for entertainment purposes. Yet maybe they were not such a good idea, as they may have appeared as catalysts towards a growing international concern. The Saint portrays spying unconventionally, and has always done so. Much like many other attributes of the character in the universe he exists in, Simon Templar is not a spy in the literal term, yet shares elements of both a spy and a vigilante in all of his appearances throughout the decades. Existing within close proximity of many other spy flicks throughout the 60s, such as the famous James Bond and Harry Palmer, Roger Moore's depiction of naturally shares some more contemporary attitudes towards spying and espionage, as opposed to his previous depictions, again linking back to the evolution of masculinity throughout the career's existence. As masculinity meant something different towards the novel and early film period, Simon Templar dealt with many opponents more viciously and violently, owing to the period's ideals of masculinity representing courageous men as strong, hard-working, and hard-fisted men who were rough around the edges. Like many other aspects presented in smoothly and suavely in Roger Moore's depiction, spying is also approached with more thought, and many examples of futuristic spy technology can be witnessed within the first few episodes, let alone further down the series' development. For example, the remote listening device in episode 1. Although already existent by the time the Saint TV series was broadcasting, the show made use of many still futuristic technologies throughout Templar's adventures, including a very early episode being The Careful Terrorist, involving remote control explosives set in an attempted murder against Templar in a time when remote controls of any sort were largely unheard of. Bearing these factors in mind, I'd like to argue that, unlike many historians reflecting upon the TV series and Templar's apparent evolution into the playboy masculine ideal, I often view Roger Moore's depiction of Templar as still very traditional in its essence. Such as many critics enjoy a level of exaggeration, I do not find Roger Moore as overly playboy in his social and work ethic, much like many make him out to be, but still considerably conservative and honest in his approach to almost everything throughout the series. Dressing finely and looking dandy, he does not consume copious amounts of material culture like many argue, but seems to dress particularly unassumingly, just as his earlier novel counterparts would do, often adorning tweed jackets and an overall smart but not flamboyant look. My argument differs against this apparent agreement on Moore's portrayal of Templar as soaking up a new style of flamboyant masculinity, in that I believe he is none of this, but somewhere in between, remaining traditional in many senses, including his respect and courteousness for anyone around him, but still edging towards the contemporary jet-set lifestyle experienced by many in the 60s, such as James Bond. I think that this particular hybrid approach to his personality portrayed in the show is not only a reflection of his malleability as a character, but also an underlying yet defining factor as to why he is so fondly remembered and ultimately adored throughout the 60s and for decades to come.